Yep. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lawrence, and with my teammate Niky, we represent the affirmative side. Today, we strongly support the motion that SMSFs investing in Sydney residential property are fueling a housing bubble. To avoid confusion, let me define key terms. An SMSF, or self-managed super fund, is a retirement fund where individuals manage their own investments. Sydney residential property refers to all housing within Greater Sydney. And a housing bubble is when property prices rise rapidly and excessively, disconnected from fundamentals such as income growth or rental yields, often leading to unsustainable prices. As the first speaker, I'll briefly explain how Sydney is already in bubble-like conditions and how SMSFs add fuel through billions in capital inflows, generous borrowing, and the underperformance of traditional super funds. Niky, the second speaker, will expand on how SMSF's tax concessions and structural advantages give them an outsized impact in Sydney's inelastic housing supply market. Our contention is clear. SMSFs create an artificial and powerful source of demand in the Sydney housing market, inflating prices beyond fundamentals, worsening affordability, and crowding out ordinary households. Let's start with the market. Residential dwellings in Australia are now valued at 11.56 trillion, with Sydney at the centre of this surge. Sydney is the second least affordable housing market globally, with a median multiple of 13.8, meaning it takes nearly 14 years of household income to buy a median price home. Prices are rising far faster than income, leaving ordinary buyers priced out without extraordinary capital or credit. And into this overheated market comes SMSFs. The ATO's own data shows that SMSF residential property allocation jumped from just under 39 billion in 2020 to 56.6 billion in 2025, a nearly 45% increase in just 5 years, with the steepest growth in past 3 years. That's not trivial. It proves SMSFs are not static, but a rapidly growing force in housing demand. And crucially, this demand is debt-fueled. ATO's data show that limited recourse borrowing arrangements, the special loans SMSF used to buy property, have risen in tandem with property allocations. Around 1 in 4 SMSF property purchases are now debt funded, and 92% of the loans go into residential housing. In other words, retirees are not just investing savings, they're leveraging up, magnifying their purchasing power and amplifying market risks. Why are SMSFs rushing to property? Performance incentives. APRA has found that 1 in 5 traditional super funds underperform benchmarks. Meanwhile, research from the University of Adelaide found SMSFs outperformed by over 4 percentage points in 2021 to 2022. That encourages more Australians, especially younger ones, to shift into SMSFs, where property is that standout choice. This allows many to funnel their funds straight into property, especially in Sydney, where capital gains expectations are the strongest. Put simply, Sydney is already stretched beyond fundamentals. SMSFs are injecting billions of tax-advantaged, highly leveraged capital into the market. Features like LRBA loans means these purchases don't even affect the ability to borrow outside super, effectively multiplying their buying power. SMSFs may look small on paper, but their leveraged billions are punching far above their weight, fueling Sydney's bubble. That's why the motion must stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence, for sharing your stance and introducing the topic of Sydney's housing bubble. While I do agree with you that Sydney has a housing crisis, which is making it increasingly difficult for Australians to purchase property, I will have to disagree with you on the point that this is being fueled by SMSFs. You argue that SMSFs are growing too fast and pushing affordability down. While I agree that they have grown over time, an important factor to take into consideration is the scale of it. Despite their growth, SMSF investment only makes up for a small fraction of Sydney's residential property market. This is simply not enough to fuel a bubble. In my argument, I will be highlighting the real cause of Sydney's housing bubble, which put simply comes down to supply and demand. You also made the point that SMSFs are debt-filled, using LRBAs at high leverage. True, LRBAs exist, but they are tightly regulated with APRA and many lenders having capped exposure. The idea that SMSFs supercharge demand is overstated when banks already stress test loans with stricter serviceability standards. Hi, my name is Ritika, and as part of the native team, I'll be discussing why SMSFs are not fueling the housing bubble. Let's first start by looking at scale. The affirmative side makes it sound like SMSFs are flooding the market, but in reality, they're a drop in the ocean. SMSFs hold around $56 billion in residential property. Compare that to Sydney's total housing market, which is valued at about $2.4 trillion. That's less than 3%. Even if SMSF property holdings doubled tomorrow, it still wouldn't move the needle enough to create a housing bubble. Housing bubbles are driven by mass speculative behavior across the market, not a niche retirement vehicle that only a fraction of Australians even use. The second point I'd like to make is on what is actually fueling housing prices. It's not SMSFs, it's supply and migration. Since 2022, New South Wales has faced a housing shortfall of more than 44,000 dwellings. At the same time, net overseas migration has surged, with over 500,000 arrivals in a single year. The housing demand dwarfs any pressure SMSFs contribute. Research shows that 1% increase in local population from migration drives a nearly 1% increase in housing prices annually. That dominates any influence from SMSFs. And here's the kicker, SMSFs can't explain why rents are also rising. Rent moves because of supply and demand imbalances, not because of few retirees decided to put property in their super fund portfolio. Finally, let's look at the nature of SMSFs themselves. They're not speculative day traders looking to flip houses. They're retirement vehicles governed by strict ATO and APRA regulations with capped borrowings and compliance requirements. Trustees are legally obliged to invest prudently and with the long-term retirement interests of members in mind. This makes SMSFs conservative investors, focused on things like stability, yield, and long-term returns. By putting some money into residential property, they diversify their portfolios and actually provide stability to the market, not volatility. If we're talking about what fuels bubbles, it's speculative developers, heavily leveraged investors, and policy failures around supply, not a tightly regulated long-term saving structure like SMSFs. So when we take a step back, the evidence is clear. SMSFs are not the villains here. SMSFs are too small to fuel the bubble. The real pressure comes from migration and supply shortages. And SMSFs themselves are conservative, regulated players. Blaming SMSFs is simply distraction from the real housing affordability issues facing Sydney. I will now pass on to the second speaker of the affirmative side.
Yep. Thanks, Lawrence, for the spectacular opening statement and Ritika for your thought and insight. However, I personally disagree with some of your arguments. First, the belief that SMSF are too small to influence the housing market is misleading. While they may only hold a minority share, the effect comes from the extra demand they bring. Housing bubbles often also driven by contracted demand from wealthy investors competing for a limited number of properties. They also tend to focus on high demand suburbs, where first home buyers are trying to compete, making it harder for Australians to enter the market. Second, while migration, supply shortage, and rental pressure do shape Sydney housing market, this factor alone cannot explain the speed and sharpness of recent price surge. Bubble occurs when speculations and investment behavior go beyond basic supply and demand. SMSF also supported by tax concessions. Often they purchase property not for income, but for the expectation of rising prices. Finally, even if SMSF are regulated, this does not remove their influence on the regulations ensuring compliance, but it cannot prevent funds from chasing the same property. Therefore, their collective actions amplify demand and fuel higher prices. To understand this better, let's take a closer look at the supply and demand on an economic scale. When SMSF pour billions into housing, the number of homes doesn't suddenly increase, since the supply is slow and fixed in the short term. That mismatch means more money is chasing the same limited houses, which drives price up and make home less affordable. When people say, oh, they only invested a small amount, but actually a small increase in demand really matters when supply is very inelastic, especially in Sydney, where it was very constrained by zoning, land, and many regulations. Moreover, SMSF have a very massive tax advantages. SMSF have 30% lower tax for rental income. Believe this, SMSF pay only 15%, while individual can pay up to 45%. Talking about long-term capital gain, when SMSF buy a property and sell it after 12 months, they got a 1/3% discount on a taxable gain. So instead of paying 15%, the effective rate on the capital gain dropped to 10%. And once in the retirement phase, SF, SMSF didn't need to pay any taxes on both income and capital gains. So together, this tax perk make property far more attractive for SMSF than for ordinary buyers. giving them an unfair advantage and, of course, fueling extra demand. So in conclusion, SMSF do boost Sydney housing bubble. Even if their share is small, they inject billions into overheated market, pushing price further out of reach. Sydney housing supply is slow and elastic and inelastic, so even a limited SMSF activity forces price higher through bidding pressure. With tax rules that let them pay for far less than ordinary Australians, SMSF enjoy an unfair advantage that make property their preferred investment. And remember, even a small role doesn't make you innocent. Small actions can still have huge impact, and in this case, we believe SMSF are helping fuel Sydney housing bubbles.
Thanks for those insights there, Niky. I do want to discuss a couple of the arguments you made there. So on your point about tax advantages, while there are incentives like reduced capital gains and income tax in a self-managed super fund, these apply to all asset classes, not just property. So they don't specifically encourage investment into housing uniquely. To give another example, franked dividends from shares also give you strong tax benefits. So property inside a self-managed super fund is simply one alternative, and the added complexity of borrowing and managing it can actually deter investors. On the idea that ordinary households struggle to compete with these funds, well, households are actually competing with the entire market. That is, other households, investors, and overseas buyers, not just self-managed super funds. Furthermore, they only make up a fraction of demand, and government policy and sentiment is shifting to boost the purchasing power of first home buyers, which I'll discuss in further detail. So onto my main arguments. Let's think about who's really making the waves in the housing market. So expanding on what my colleague discussed, total self-managed super fund investment in residential property, both directly and through LRBAs, was 83.1 billion in 22 to 23, and that represents only about 0.8% of the total Australian residential property market. To put that into perspective, in the June quarter of 2025 alone, owner-occupied loan commitments were 54.7 billion. So you can see here that regular household borrowing outweighs that of self-managed super funds. The truth is the market outside of these funds is making the biggest waves, and the government schemes increase purchasing power of regular households. We also need to look at the supply side. Yes, self-managed super funds might add some demand, but that's overshadowed by an ongoing shortage of supply. It could also be argued that some self-managed super funds are actually easing pressure by investing indirectly into the housing market through property developers, helping to fund new housing. Furthermore, borrowing through an LRBA requires about $200,000 in your super balance. So only large diversified funds can even consider that. And with strict regulations, property might not be the most attractive choice inside a super fund. So it's safe to say, based on the asset breakdowns inside a self-managed super fund, they have diversified their portfolio to potentially include investments in property developers. Meanwhile, the government's target is 1.2 million new homes by 2029, or 240,000 per year. However, in 2023 to 24, only 176,000 homes were built. And this shortfall is what is driving prices significantly, not self-managed super funds. And I also wanted to discuss what's on the horizon for Australia's property market. So we all know about the first home buyer scheme as it is. It allows those locked out of home ownership by high deposit amounts, fees, and limited borrowing capacity to enter the housing market. There are many more first home buyers, non-first home buyers, and direct investors contributing to the housing bubble. And the scheme is actually changing to provide even greater access to a wider range of home buyers by increasing the availability of credit. And what drives up prices more than allowing buyers to access more credit to purchase their homes? So from the 1st of October, we will see no place limits, no income caps, higher property price caps, and simpler access in regional areas. You can see in New South Wales alone that property price cap will be lifted to 1.5 million, which will especially inflate the prices of lower value dwellings. On top of that, the CBA and NAB economists predict a further reduction in the cash rate within the next 2 quarters to about 3.35%, further increasing the availability of credit overall. All of this is happening whilst there is still a bottleneck in supply, and it's unclear whether the supply will increase sufficiently to ease the housing bubble. So if we're talking about what's really fueling the bubble, it's these schemes, easier credit, and undersupply of housing. I'll now pass it back on to Lawrence, the first affirmative.
Thank you, Jake. Your argument sounds persuasive, but it suffers from strawman fallacy. You suggest SMSF must be the biggest force in Sydney housing to matter. That's never our claim. Our case is about impact, not size. SMSFs inject billions in tax-advantaged, leveraged capital into a supply-constrained market. In Sydney, even a smaller pool of money can drive prices up. Saying owner-occupiers dominate ignores that bubbles are fueled at the margin by buyers with outsized financial firepower. Yes, first home buyer schemes and rate cuts add pressure, but that strengthens our point. SMSFs on top of these forces amplify demand, and when supply is tight, that's enough to fuel the bubble. So the question isn't whether SMSFs are the biggest players, it's whether they make an overheated market hotter. The answer is yes. Thank you for listening.